السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في مركز دراسات.
In the name of God, peace be upon you. I would like to welcome you from the Center for Islamic and Global Affairs, SIGA, in Istanbul, Sabah Din Zaim University. This is the sixth symposium that, on a series of symposia that we are doing in collaboration with the Center for Islamic Studies in Hamad University in Qatar, about studying the Islamic movements in governance and politics, discussing their experience and the lessons learned from this, from their experience. Today, we will be speaking about the Libyan experience, and we have four speakers, some of the distinguished members who are going to present a presentation about this experience, and then we will have two commentators. The first speaker will be Mr. Sulaiman Abdul Qadir under the title The Islamic Movement in Libya, the Historic Context, Ideological Background and Organizational Framework. Mr. Abdul Qadir was born in Benghazi in 1966. He studied there his high school, and then he joined Brega to study in Najm al-Sada Technical University, or the Shining Star or Bright Star Technical University, where he got his master's, bachelor degree, and then he continued his master's. And then in the 1990s, he had to leave for Switzerland, where he has been living there as a political refugee, and he got it from Zurich University. He got a bachelor degree in business administration, and he led a number of associations in Switzerland, including the Association of Children and Youth and the Muslim Association in Switzerland from 2002 and 2004. And he was responsible for the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood group from 2005 until 2011. The second speaker will be under the title The Vision of the Islamic Movement and the Justice and Building Party experience in building the Libyan state. It will be presented by Mr. Abu Bakr Bilal. He is a member of the Justice and Building party that is emanating from the Muslim Brotherhood, and he is a member, and he was a higher circles member in the periods in 2014, 2018, and he was also in the political bureau in 2019, 2020, and he has written some books about literature and books. So the third speaker will be about the Justice Party, the experiences, failures, and successes. It will be delivered by Dr. Nizar Krikish. Dr. Nizar is a former founder member in the Justice and Building party, and he is the head of Bayan Study Center in Istanbul, and he has written a number of books in Islamic political science, and he is a member, an independent researcher with a number of research centers in the Arab world. The fourth paper will be about the Islamic movement in Libya, lessons learned and the future prospects. It will be delivered by Dr. Majida Al-Fallah. Dr. Majida is member of the Libyan Academy for Higher Studies, and she is a member of the Higher State Council in Tripoli, and she was a member of the National Council after the first elections in 2012, and in 2015 it became the Higher Center or the Higher State Council, and she is member of the Association Against Corruption in Libya. She is a researcher in regional and local studies in the African department in the Libyan Academy for Higher Studies. Basically, she was a physician, and she studied pathology from Ireland, and she also has a master's degree in the Sharia and the religion from France. After these presentations, we will have two comments. The first comment will be by Dr. Khairi Omar, Dr. Khairi is an associate professor in Sakarya University in Turkey, and he got the master's degree and PhD degree in political science from Cairo University. He has a number of in-depth studies about the Egyptian, Libyan, Ethiopian relations and the Muslim brotherhoods, and he focuses on the Islamic transformation and Islamic parties. And he writes in a number of the reviewed journals, including the Journal of the Middle East and another journal for the Middle East and the political research. The other comment, it will be about from Dr. Muhammad Umaish. He is from Tripoli, and he was a former diplomat in the foreign ministry. He worked as a consultant to the presidential council between 2015 and 2018, and he was 2018, and he was also an ambassador of Libya, and he was the general coordinator of the Coordination Council of February Civil Revolution, and he was responsible for the work with the Executive Office and the UN mission for the supporting Libya until he received his mission as an ambassador to Kuwait. Dr. Umaish had a PhD in education, humanitarian and human development, and IT from the United States. At the time, he was the head of the largest student association in the United States and Canada. It was the Muslim association in North America, and he has a number of participation in a lot of conferences as well as in diplomatic action. We would like to welcome you all to this symposium to speak about the Libyan experience, and we will start with Dr. Sulaiman Abdel Qadir. You have 25 minutes for your presentation. The floor is yours. The speaker is muted.
Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah.
In the name of God, all the praise be to Allah, and all the blessings and prayers be upon His Messenger. I'm very glad to be among you, and I hope that my presentation will be useful for you. Unfortunately, the lack of reference on the Islamic movement in Libya and the lack of opinion and the other opinion throughout the periods of the Gaddafi rule makes us lack the references to talk about this issue or to comment on the papers. My paper is an introduction and a brief background on Libya. I was very brief on that, and then I spoke about the Sanusi movement, as it was the movement that led to the Libyan kingdom, and because the Libyan kingdom was the period that witnessed the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood group. Afterwards, I speak about the September coup or the September regime and the phases that it went through. Then I concluded my paper speaking about the Muslim Brotherhood and how they dealt with the reality they were living in. In the introduction, I focused on the following fact, that to evaluate any action or any effort or any dynamics, this should be in the context of the past. So if we are evaluating the work of a group or a movement, we should learn the context in which it was playing in order to have a just evaluation. And we can see the dynamics of the actions and the decisions that were made by this movement, and whether they had a future perspective, or they were dealing in the inherent norm of the human dealings, which is action and reaction. So I focused on the Muslim Brotherhood because the it is the movement that started in the days of the kingdom and continues to be there. Libya has seen some other movements, but in general, those movements were reactionary uh, that came from young people who were enthusiastic and emotional about Islam. So I don't focus on them. There is only one party that I didn't mention because I know that it was established, and to the best of my knowledge, it doesn't exist anymore, which is the Tahrir or the liberation movement. However, the Muslim Brotherhood. Through studying the Muslim Brotherhood, we can evaluate the Islamic movement in Libya at large. The Libyan history wasn't paid justice in many of its points history. It was depicted so many times that it is a desert that has some spots in the east and in the west, although it has a long history. And Libya is the homeland of the Karamanli state that was dominating the Middle East. And Libya was the first republic in the Islamic world, and it is the homeland of the Sanusi movement, and it is the homeland of jihad, on top of whom we know the well-known Omar al-Mukhtar, and it was the first constitutional monarchy in the Islamic world. It was also founded in Libya. It is well known that Islam entered Libya in the days of the Caliphate Omar ibn al-Khattab, and under the days of Amr ibn al-As. Amr ibn al-As thought that in order to have stability in Egypt, he should get into Barqa. So he conquered Barqa and parts of Tripoli, and Islam entered Libya during that time. And Libya has witnessed everything that was witnessed by the Islamic world, uh, of both the strength and weaknesses that the Islamic world have gone through. The Sanusi movement came as an idea with its the owner of the idea, Imam Ali al-Sanusi from Algeria. The idea was based on the fact that the discretion in religion is available, and it is the rights for the ummah to practice discretion or ijtihad, and uh, and based on the saying of Imam Malik, who said that every speech or anything that is said in this regard in religion can be debated unless the sayings of the owner of this prophet, and he was in front of the grave of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So he was a follower of the Maliki school of thought, and he said, my belief in the Maliki school of thought accepts discretion or ijtihad in religion. So the movement started as an idea, and it took the form of a Sufi way, and the journey of the founding Imam started from Algeria to Libya, then Egypt, and then Hijaz, where there were followers there, and then he came back to Libya, specifically on the Green Mount, and he built the first corner or place of worship, which was the white corner or Azawi al-Bayda, and that was the first Sufi corner in the region, in the area. It is noteworthy to take into consideration the deep thoughts or the vision of the Imam when he established that corner or a place of worship, and he left the cities or urban life, and that was symbolic, and he focused on the remote and rural areas, but he continued to promote the Sufi way, despite building these corners, worship corners. And then the leadership of the Sufi way or order came to somebody who was called Al-Jaghbub, who was looking for the future, and he thought that he will be or he will get away from the coastline, which is under recurring attacks by the Ottomans. Imam Ali as-Sanusi, peace, may he rest in peace, when he was thinking about that, he thought that this order or this way will improve. So he distributed the worship corners in a way that linked Barqa together, and then linked the region of Tripoli and the region of Fazan together, and he moved towards the south. After that, Imam Muhammad al-Mahdi came, and bin Muhammad al-Mahdi, may he rest in peace, the movement of the order or the way into a movement was crystallized, because it used in its distribution this network, building on this network to have a jihadi movement that started against the French forces that expanded from Niger and Chad and attacked the Sanusi worship corners. So jihad started or were launched against the French forces. Afterwards, when Ahmad al-Sharif, may he rest in peace, after Muhammad al-Mahdi took the leadership of the Sanusi movement, he announced jihad against the Italian forces in 1911. And from that dealing with the reality, something was established, which was that the movement was not looking at itself as a movement, but it is actually inheriting the state after the withdrawal of the Ottoman forces. Ahmad al-Sharif started to establish the Sanusi forces, and he was managing the affairs in that way. Then things developed, and there were confrontation between the Ottoman Caliphate and or when there were confrontations between the Ottoman Caliphate and the British, the Ottomans asked Imam Ahmad to attack the West, the English in the West, in Egypt. And that leads to understanding that the Ottomans were dealing with Ahmad al-Sharif as an authority in Libya after they left Libya, after the fort, the Ottoman fort in Libya left. Or the Ottoman garrison left the Libya. After this attack that was conducted by Ahmad al-Sharif, he left the leadership of the movement to Idris al-Sanusi, may he rest in peace, who started to manage the movement. And because of the closure of the supply routes that were coming from Egypt to the Mujahideen in Libya to perform jihad against the Italian forces, jihad was surrounded, and it was limited to Ajdabia. Then it was eliminated. Then the leader of a Sanusi movement was in Egypt, and from there started to lead a political movement, which led in the end the independence of Libya and the establishment of the Libyan monarchy or kingdom. So through what I have read, I concluded that the movement went through these phases, the phase of a religious order or way, and then it moved to into a movement, and then went to practice da'wah, then to perform jihad, and then it went into practicing politics, and it took the responsibility of finding a solution for Libya until it reached the announcement or the declaration of the kingdom. And that was the constitutional monarchy, which in its constitution doesn't refer to the Sanusi movement in leadership, although it was a Sanusi monarchy. So what we can read or what we can induce from this movement is that the movement, since its beginnings, Imam Muhammad bin Ali as-Sanusi wanted to reassure the Ottoman rulers and or prefects, and they were reassured that they are not seeking authority, and they were only spreading knowledge and literacy in the lands. Even in the higher door in Istanbul, there were respect for as-Sanusi. So since the beginning, he worked on not having any conflicts amongst the followers of the same religion. This is a very distinguished element in the Sanusi da'wah or in the Sanusi order, because they dealt in that way with the Ottoman state or Ottoman Caliphate the same. They didn't try to compete with other Sufi movements, uh, and some of the followers of the Sanusi movement in the western side of Libya, they joined Suwahbi, and Safiyuddin asked them to go or to draw back towards the east in order not to have any confrontation with other mujahideen. And what happened in Chad, and how the movement was neutral in that conflict, although Muhammad al-Mahdi uh, he was not convinced with the Mahdi movement and not fighting with the Ottoman Empire. He tried to stay away from their areas of control and to go to remote areas. So the factor of uh, staying away from any confrontation among the followers of the religion. That was dominating factor in the Sanusi movement, and the Sanusi movement also joined the three regions together, and there were some demonstrations in 1952 which was considered to be against the parties. And in 1956, the Libyan law had annexed other articles to 206, to 207, and 209. Those articles didn't criminalize partisan work, but they criminalized the secret work, and criminalized any one who seeks toppling the regime or changing the regime. And they criminalized also establishing any international organizations in Libya without licenses or without permission from the state.
دستور 1951 كان
In
ينص
the Constitution of 1951, of course, it was talking about parties, but the elections didn't allow to have lists for the elections for the parties. So there was a law, or there was a promise that a law will be issued for organizing the participation of laws, but of participation of parties, but it would never happen, and that was one of the critiques against the Sanusi movement. Then the King Idris, and when he was in power, he started to bring the movement back to be a Sufi order and to step away from politics. Of course, the coup that was conducted by the Gaddafi, and how did it start? It started as a coup against the monarchy, the announcement of the republic. Afterwards, it extended by announcing the cultural revolution, and then it became a coup against the state and the institutions in the historic Zuwara declaration with its 5 points. For example, suspending all the laws, a popular revolution against bureaucracy, a cultural revolution. All of these points were or constituted a coup against what remained from the state and a coup against political liberties. Because after declaring this cultural revolution, the heads of parties and the prominent figures started to disappear. Then this expansion uh, continued on the private sector, nationalizing the private sector entirely and the eliminating the bourgeois and the class. And then we started to see the popular committees that start to crush on the people, and they spread widely in the country. And that was a coup against the society entirely, by a coup that implanted this entity, which was a tool for prosecution and oppression. Then there was a coup against the army, establishing battalions whose objective was protecting the heads of the regime. Of course, the coup against the army was in the context of the weaponized or the armed people, and some people look at that as a willingness for establishing a strong army, but the result that we saw at the towards ultimately was eliminating the army, because the coup was against the army as well and against the state. The Muslim Brotherhood group was established in Libya through three young people, Azadin Ibrahim, Mahmoud al-Sharbini, and Jawad Saada, who entered Libya and stayed in Al-Manar palace with King Idris, who gave them political asylum. And Azadin Ibrahim had the impact in Barqa region for this ideology and to have a current following the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as through the Egyptian teachers who were teaching in Libya. This is something that I read written by Ashura Shams, saying that he was influenced by the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood through the Egyptian teachers who were brought by King Idris to work in Libya, as well as through some of the students who were studying in scholarships in Egypt, who were influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood's current. So the Muslim Brotherhood was uh, a thought current until the 70s, where the leadership family or the leadership circle was established. Mr. Coup says that it was in the year 1967. I have evidence that shows that it was in 1964, not 1967. Anyway, this organization it was established and it wasn't announced. It didn't have a center. It wasn't announced in the gazette or in the newspapers, but the intelligence centers were aware of the founding of this organization, and of course the same intelligence organization that were used by Gaddafi to crush on the the group in 1970s. So it started as a current of the Muslim Brotherhood, then it became an organization, and after the Cultural Revolution, or after 1973, some of the members were forced to uh, dis- uh, dissolve the organization. And of course, it is different from the organization or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. It is closer to the Takfiri groups. And during the days of Sadat, the Libyans didn't have a chance to understand the reality of the terminology that were attributed to Sayyid Qutb. And of course, the media influence of the regime of Abdel Nasser influenced the Muslim Brotherhood, so it became limited and working in secrecy. In the 1980s, although it was the worst period in the Libyan history, after 42 or in the 42 years of the Gaddafi rule, but there was a religious awakening by some people who were impacted by the ideology of the Al-Tabligh group. Of course, I'm speaking about groups, but there were some individuals with some bright ideas. But as a general awakening of the country, it came during the time, and that coincided with the return of some students who were studying in scholarships outside Libya. So the Muslim Brotherhood was revived anew, and it started to be found in different regions in Libya, and it started to work under one leadership. In this period, which is in the 80s.
In the 90s, this organization continued in the same manner, and the regime's tight grip started to loosen, particularly in economic terms. As I mentioned, by the end of the 80s, we had a group that was affiliated with the Qutb group, and there was another group who worked under the Muslim Brotherhood and then joined their ranks. But then in the 90s, we had an organizational matter or problem. My time has expired, but allow me to conclude. In the 90s, we had this split or division from which we emerged what we call the Islamic Assembly or gathering. And because of the activity and the work of the Islamic Assembly, there were the events of the 90s. Some of them were arrested, and they revealed their secret organization, and we had those indications of the presence of the Muslim Brotherhood organization, but it was only unveiled in 1998 in what came to be known as the Muslim Brotherhood case. After those events of the 1998, a new leadership in exile was declared, and this work from the exile or from abroad started, and during that time the group was liberated from its secrecy and started to prove itself and identify itself, and started to try to be more involved in politics, and it stood out for the demand for reform which it adopted. And that demand was not because they were keen on the persistence of the regime, but out of knowledge and being well aware of the dear price that communities and societies have to pay for upheavals or uprisings. So they adopted the idea of gradual change or reform, but the regime reacted with much arrogance and refused to open the floor for any concessions until the 17th of February, the revolution of 17th of February. During the revolution and before the revolution, this group worked based on a vision that was rather mature, and it tried to preempt what was about to happen in Libya. But I will leave that for the discussion, I hope. and it adopted a policy or an orientation that it did not want to assume sole leadership of the revolution. So it did not form a front for itself, but created institutions that were open to all social strata. And that was very important because they did not fall into the mistake of claiming to be the sole representative or the sole leader of the revolution. Rather, they offered their institutions and opened them up for all revolutionists. So it sort of assimilated with the other social strata and with the community and worked within it. I will have to stop here because I believe in the other papers by my colleagues, there will be light shed on what happened after that, because by the end of the revolution, this movement resigned and called for elections, and it was decided that the Muslim Brotherhood would start a political party in cooperation or in partnership with others. In this overview, I focused on a few points which I summarize here. The Muslim Brotherhood throughout this time have proven that they had a strong organization. They were very well organized and they remained strong even in the darkest eras, even in the 1980s, which was one of the worst decades in Libya. And those who lived during that period would know that very well. The Muslim Brotherhood persisted and continued during that decade, and they also maintained their moderation, although Sahwa in Libya, or the was rather version and thrived on tapes and recordings and smuggled books because there were no Sharia or religious leaders at the time to lead this Sahwa. So there were many ideas from the Salafi to the Jihadi to the Takfiri. But the Muslim Brotherhood were not driven away by those ideas, and they persisted in their moderate thought, and they were not involved in any extremist or detrimental actions. Undoubtedly, for an organization to start in secrecy. Can you please conclude in 2 minutes? So, secrecy, although it was a reaction to the circumstances, it reflected adversely on the organization. Maybe this is something I would elaborate upon in the discussion in terms of its efficiency as well as its dependence on the Egyptian model, even in its methodology and its symbols. We only have the symbols for grievances rather than, or injustice rather than the symbols of giving. And also they particularly under the Sanusi, under the monarchy, the Muslim Brotherhood had the chance to take a vital role, but unfortunately, for reasons that I'm not fully aware of, they didn't seize that opportunity well. Thank you so much, Mr. Sulaiman. Mr. Sulaiman started his presentation saying that references are few in relation to the history of the Islamic movement in Libya, and that they are based mostly on verbal accounts. And he gave an overview, an historic overview about the Islamic movement in Libya, particularly the Sanusi movement, and then the Muslim Brotherhood, and how it dealt with the coup of Gaddafi, and he said that talking of any social movement has to be based on the context within which it started and whether it was based on a vision or on an action reaction sort of attitude. The Muslim Brotherhood, he said, could be said to have constituted the continuum of Islamic movement, and that Libya was a vessel connecting the east to the west and had its importance in Islamic history, and it witnessed the emergence of the Sanusi movement, and it was one of the very first countries that that embraced Islam, and it during Umar ibn al-Khattab's caliphate. Um, but the Sanusi school of thought adopted a vision saying that ijtihad or discretion was still open, but they took a Sufi trend and Sanusi focused on remote areas, but then he moved the leadership of the Sufi methodology from coastal areas to internal areas to avoid being targeted. And after Sanusi, we had Muhammad al-Sanusi, Muhammad al-Mahdi, who developed this movement so much so it started jihad against the French, and we also had Ahmad al-Sharif, and it was clear that this movement was to be the heir of the occupants and colonialists. Muhammad al-Sanusi then started a political endeavor that ended up with the independence of Libya. So he moved from the Sufi corner to a Dawah movement, and then organization, a jihadi movement, and finally to have a political entity, starting what was called a constitutional monarchy. Al-Imam al-Sanusi did not aim to compete the Ottomans. He wanted to continue his dawah and Islamic endeavors. That's why the Sanusi movement stood neutrally or impartially in any conflict with the Ottomans. They introduced there were laws introduced to the Libyan code that incriminated secret political work, and then we had the coup of al-Qaddafi, and then he suspended working by many of the laws, and many of the political elites who were arrested, and revolutionary movements or revolutionary committees were established, and they protected the army and the leadership of the coup. The elites of the movement some came from Egypt, and they had much influence. And also we had the Egyptian teachers who went to Libya to work, and also exchange students who went to Egypt and came back bringing with them the ideas they learned. That's why they started working secretly. But then in the 70s, this organization was dissolved because there was the influence of Abdel Nasser's regime, and many of Sayyid Qutb's ideas were not fully understood in Libya. And in the 70s, there was Sahwa in Libya and elsewhere, and the influence of a Tabligh became visible. So this organization started to be revived in Libya under one leadership. In the 90s, we had a division within the organization, and we had the Islamic Gathering or the Islamic Assembly, but it was discovered by the regime in 1998, after which the workers started to be declared from exile or from abroad, but they remained calling only for reform because they understood the dear price that had to be paid otherwise. But the regime would not respond until the revolution of February 2011. During the revolution, they opened their institutions to all revolutionists and did not monopolize the leadership of the revolution, and they established partnerships with everyone. To conclude, he said the Muslim Brotherhood was rather resilient and strong, and the 80s was the worst decade ever in Libya, but the Muslim Brotherhood survived and they maintained their moderation, although there were many ideologies that were spread, particularly violence and extremism. On the other hand, secrecy was a necessity dictated by the circumstances, but it had its adverse consequences on the movement. Thank you so much, Mr. Sulaiman. We move now to the second paper by Dr. Abu Bakr Bilal, Mr. Abu Bakr Bilal, talking about the project and the vision of the Justice and Building Party in Libya. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, may praise be to God and peace and blessings be upon Prophet Muhammad and his companions, his family. I am grateful for this invitation. I
والسيد مدير المركز دكتور سامي
thank SIGA and Sabah al-Din University in Istanbul for this symposium. Actually, to talk about the vision of the Justice and Building Party and their stance of the current political crisis necessitates that we go back a little to quickly have an overview of the roots of this current crisis. After the revolution of the 17th of February, we could say that Libya went through two main phases. First, it was the phase we could describe as a political phase in which politics was practiced in the way it is recognized by elections and a government and a legislative and presidential council, and politics was practiced in the parliament between different parliamentary blocks, whether those composed of political parties or other blocks which constituted people who or comprised individuals who ran for offices within the council. The other phase was political division. This phase started in the middle of 2014 and continues to date. This period of political division was featured international agreements pioneered by the UN mission to Libya, and during this period politics was played in a different mode by accessing or engaging in those agreements by all actors, be them the political actors, particularly the legislative bodies that were elected after the revolution of February, and the General National Conference. Also, those agreements comprised some public figures, politicians and independent politicians, and political process started to run in a manner that is different from the typical mode of affairs. It included using military action and mobilizing or making use of relations with the United Nations mission, etc. You know very well that the main reason for the political crisis in Libya, which started with the political division I talked about, was the counter-revolution project in the area, which targeted Arab Spring countries. In Libya, of course, we had Al-Karama process by the retired general Khalifa Haftar, after which we had this political division. This counter-revolution process was able to prevail completely in some of the Arab Spring countries and only partially in some other countries. In Libya, however, there are a number of other reasons behind this division. Those sub-reasons was that the political practice was still nascent, particularly in the General National Conference. This political practice was based on rivalry rather than consensus, and that was in the context of a fragile state that has just emerged from a totalitarian era or regime. And during that period, it would have been better for political practitioners to seek political consensus, which would have stopped or blocked the way of the counter-revolution, or at least it would have prevented the military conflict that started since 2014. Of course, these international agreements, including a Sakhirat agreement in 2015, they started to formulate the political scene in Libya from the Sakhirat through to the Geneva Agreement. They did not succeed in putting an end to division, and the reason was the contradictions between the international projects for Libya, most of which aimed at restoring the dictatorship and autocracy, of course, because of the counter-revolution project, but this time using political means after they failed in imposing dictatorship again through military action. This division persisted since the Sakhirat agreement in 2015 until 2019, when Tripoli came under fire. This date was a decisive or a turning point in political history of Libya, because this aggression against Tripoli did not work as planned by regional powers that supported the military action. That's why some political gaps or developments of the war were exploited by some new powers that came along, such as Russia and Turkey. Russia supported the military action on the side of Haftar in his aggression against Tripoli, although the real target of the Russian state was not to support Haftar, but to support the resumption of the former regime by Saif ad-Din al-Qaddafi, the son of late al-Qaddafi. On the other hand, we had Turkey, which supported the national defense forces to the west, and this aggression against Tripoli ended with the withdrawal of Haftar to Sirte, which constituted a strong blow against this military alliance because of this international balance that happened for the first time since the beginning of the Libyan crisis. Because of this war against the Libyan capital Tripoli, a new equilibrium emerged, or a new formula emerged, including new political actors such as the National Committee, which was established in March 2020, and we had the National Unity Government, the unification of the institutions. That was for the first time in response to political division. Of course, the Geneva Agreement was expected to end in the 24th of December 2021 in the presidential and parliamentary elections, but those general elections were not successful for a number of reasons. The first was that the political dialogue forum, which gave rise to the National Unity Government and to the different institutions, one of its targets was to start a constitutional basis or foundation upon which elections would be run, but this forum was unable to establish this foundation. That was a main reason for the failure of those elections. And one of the other reasons was the engagement of the Legislative Council, which took advantage of the legislative gap when the Geneva dialogue was underway. It started to issue some parliamentary non-consensual or not decisions that are not based on consensus. And also the law said that presidential elections would be run before the parliamentary elections, and that gave rise to many concerns because parliamentary elections may not succeed and only the presidential elections would succeed, which means that we will end up with a one-man show, a one person taking all the legitimacy and running the state. We also have a number of actors or states that started to be engaged, such as Russia. Those countries which started to be engaged in Libya, including Russia, one of their most important objectives was to make the transitional period even longer, and they supported a controversial figure who is Saifuddin al-Qaddafi in running for elections, and that was one of the main reasons for the failure of elections, which gave rise to a new failure in Libya. It was supposed that this crisis, the political crisis in Libya, would be sort of resolved in the elections of December, but failure to have those elections on time gave rise to a new political crisis that gave rise to the what we learned now about the extension of the transitional period and the starting a presidential committee, and this caused much rejection in the higher state Council, which is the entity that is parallel to the Eastern House of Representatives. The present political scene after the installation of Mohammed Bashar and after the recent constitutional amendments, we can say that there are two formulas right now. The first, we have an Egyptian-Russian formula, and this formula aims at extending the transitional period, hence the constitutional amendment, which extended the transitional period to 14 months with the installation of a new legislative body. We have another formula, on the other hand, which is, we could call it American European, with the exception of France, probably. This formula aims at holding elections as soon as possible, and it is the formula which was in place when the 24th of December elections were scheduled. This formula aims at holding elections as soon as possible and putting an end to the transitional period in order to start with a new political scene that puts an end to the transitional period and that expels the new political actors from Libya, particularly Russia. As for the parties' stance of both governments, I mean the Building and Justice Party, it decided not to take sides with either government, and its vision was that it refused to expand the transitional period, and it advocated for parliamentary elections as soon as possible in order to renew the conflicted legitimacy, in order to restore the political process to its course. The party refrained from taking sides with either governments because we believed that was siding with the Libyan government or with the Libyan unity government would weaken the civil movement in Libya, particularly that leaders of the party come from that movement, and they called in a consensus or an agreement in the executive branch to avoid any conflict that may give rise to armed or violent conflict. And we also in the party believe that going to those parliamentary elections would offer a great opportunity to change the current overly complicated situation, which becomes only more complicated with the existing institutions, including the parliament. And it is based on that we had the Ms. Stephanie's initiative, which called for the establishment of a committee between the higher council of the state and the parliament in order to put together the constitutional foundations to start elections as soon as possible. In our party, in the Party of Building and Justice, we found that this initiative is in line with our own vision, so we issued our fourth statement in 2021, and we welcomed this initiative, and we called both the House of Representatives and the higher state council to pay attention to this initiative and take it seriously, to build upon it in order for Libyans to be able to engage in elections as soon as possible. Also, now we are working on two main issues. We have the constitutional foundation that puts an end to the transitional period and takes us to parliamentary elections as soon as possible. This is something we are working upon in our party. Also, we're working in a post-election vision, how we can maintain the political stability, how can we make sure the political division does not recur, and we believe that international equilibrium in Libya could help with that by providing guarantees by the parties backed by the various international actors in order to maintain the emerging political order based on the maintenance of that political order as well as maintaining mutual interests with those international actors. I hope I've been successful in this overview and I welcome any comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abu Bakr. Mr. Abu Bakr Bilal spoke about how the Justice and Building Party and its position in the current political landscape, and he said that we need to go back before the February Revolution. There were two main phases. The first one was from the parliament and political negotiations and other phases, and then there was another phase in 2014, which was the division, the political division that continues until today. This phase was featured with international intervention, and politics were practiced in a different way, and they produced two legislative bodies: the National Congress, the National General Congress, and the coalition. The political parties and the activists were working at the political or the politics started to be different, including the use of military power and employing international relations and getting into agreements. The main reason of the Libyan crisis is the counter-revolution in the area, which is targeting the Arab Spring. And then he mentioned the Dignity or the Karama operation, which was led by Haftar, which is part of the counter-revolution in Libya. There were other reasons which can be sub-reasons, like, for example, the new practices of politics with the parties that came into the future, and because of the competition or the coercion of one another instead of reaching consensuses amongst the parties. Consensus could have blocked the way before the counter-revolution, but these agreements before going into Geneva failed to do so, to reach any consensus, especially the counter-revolution that started to get back and promote for dictatorship and tyranny, but that didn't work. This division continued from 2015 until the 4th of April 2019, which is the date of aggression against Tripoli by the counter-revolution, and that was a turn in history in the crisis. The military aggression was or failed, and the new players came into the landscaping, like Turkey and Russia. Haftar tried to continue that, but actually, the main reason was bringing back Saif al-Islam al-Qaddafi, and not necessarily supporting Haftar. But even Haftar was defeated before getting into Tripoli. This led to a new political landscape since March 2021. The Geneva Agreement was supposed to get into the elections or to reach elections in the last September, but it was delayed for several reasons. The political dialogue forum was supposed to lead to a number of political issues, but it failed to do so. Then the parliament there was trying to pass some laws. The competition toward leading to the elections was raised some concerns amongst some people that some parties are trying to dominate the landscape. Russia is trying to support some parties like Saif al-Islam al-Qaddafi and Haftar in order to lead or to induce a political environment that is suitable for it. The so Libya got into the relation or into a crisis where political international intervention is involved in the area in the country, and the inability to get into any political solution. So we are facing two formal modes. So the first one is a transitional period that leads into a transitional government for 24 months, and which is led by the Russians. And the other mode is supported by the European countries of France and other European countries, that will lead to sooner elections, which will get Libya out of this crisis. The building and the Justice and Building party's position says that they don't want to get with and in line with any of the governments, but it rejects a transitional period, and they call for the parliamentary elections in order to get the political process into a new track, and they don't want to weaken the civil powers in the West, and they are calling for consensus. The elections can also solve the issue of the political isolation or exclusion, and the initiative of Stephanie Williams, the spokeswoman of the UN, came up with an initiative to create a committee by the Parliament and the Supreme State Council, upon which the rules of elections can be provided. The Building and Justice Party took the initiative and built on it. He concluded that we are working on two main issues. The first one is to set the constitutional foundations for parliamentary elections, and the second is how to maintain the political landscape and not to go back to political division. Then he said that the international equilibrium in Libya can play this role in order to produce a new situation that maintains the interest of countries and puts the interest of the Libyan people on top of the agenda. Thank you very much. And now we move to the third speaker, Dr. Nizar Krikish, and he will be speaking about the justice and building, the experience, successes, and failures. The floor is yours, Mr. Nizar, Dr. Nizar. Thank you very much. Peace be upon you. I would like to thank Dr. Sami Al Arian and Sabah Din Zaim University and SIGA for this invitation. And I will try to stay or to speak in the allocated time. My paper is speaking about the successes and failures of the Justice and Building Party. I will try to summarize my paper in 25 minutes. The main idea or the main question is that this party didn't come from a social movement that is well rooted in the Libyan society. And that wasn't because the Muslim Brotherhood was unable to spread in the society, but because of the objective conditions in the Libyan context was not empowering of any political party. That's why I divided my paper into three sections. The first one was the concepts or the conceptual framework, and it is very important to understand what are the social groups and whether the features of social groups apply to the Muslim Brotherhood, the justice and the building or not. And then the trying to apply the theories in political sciences about the history of the Libyan state and whether that history allows having a social group under these conditions or not. These are two important points because they will pave the way to understand that the main failures of the justice and building are failures in the foundation. which means that there was a gap between the political action and the society, and they were raised to leadership, and with that is the problem in Libya. So after getting into that introduction, it will be easy to understand what happened to the justice and building and what are the successes and failures. In this paper, I have, of course, a personal experience. I was a founding member, and I was the deputy of the head of the Justice and Building Party, and I have made some decisions. So I'm trying to separate between my personal experience and the objective understanding or study of this experience. And now, if we start with understanding what are the social groups. This entry is very important, and it started with Charles Lister in the 70s, talking about what is the social groups, and he gave some factors or elements which gives indicators that will allow people to understand the presence of those groups and improve the society from one phase to another phase, or sorry, the improvement of the group from a movement to a party or to a social group. So the definition is any social group with an objective to fulfill that objective. There should be an organization, resources. The resources could be human resources, or ideological or organizational, all the resources that allow for the building of this organization. And then the political context. Most of the social groups are groupings of people, but they come in a certain historical context that gives them the opportunity to be present in the society. And the clearest example is the Muslim Brotherhood group in Egypt. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was an opportunity for them, because people were confused after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the messages that were sent by Imam Hassan al-Banna to the thinkers and judges and the leaders, they were received well. And then, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood with As-Sadat, there was opening in the society, and they managed to employ the resources. In Jordan, for example, also the king, because there was a conflict between Jordan and the Palestinians. So Muslim Brotherhood found a political opportunity in Jordan to play a role. That opportunity wasn't there in Libya. So that political opportunity wasn't available in Libya, and that's why they didn't have the resources. And the second element, which is the organization, and the third element was the political opportunity. Fourth, the internal culture, which is the culture that is found out is created among any group of people. So if we see, for example, the books that were written from within the group, they are very, very, very few, they are almost non-existent. So we don't know about the culture of the Muslim Brotherhood. So similar to the political culture and the political opportunity, it depends on the ability of the group to do resource mobilization, or it's based on the resource mobilization theory. So if you have resources, how you are going to mobilize the people? Of course, to mobilize people, you need to be capable of doing that. If we compare, or if we apply this model with those four pillars, we find that all of the four pillars were very weak in the Libyan context. If we speak about the resources, if we compare Egypt with Libya, for example, only the schools and the hospitals that were run by the Muslim Brotherhood. Some studies say, for example, Rethinking Books by Mr. Hamid says that they were several $1 million running the schools and hospitals. In Libya, we don't have any hospitals that are run by the Muslim Brotherhood, or schools, or any corporates. So there are no institutions. There is an organization, but the organization didn't have any political opportunity that allows it to spread within the society. This is not only limited to the Muslim Brotherhood, but this is related to the Libyan state at large. The Libyan state was coming up from the authority, from those in the top of the hierarchy, and not from the base. So there are different theories that were established about Libya, and 5 well-known books. For example, Anna Bernadetti, the Italian historian, she spoke about the structure, the genuine structure of the Libyan state of Libya was established in the diaspora. For example, we have Libyans in Egypt, the Levant, and in Tunisia, and they're speaking about one state. Even the establishment of the national identity, it was there. And there was in 1952 there was elimination of the partisan regime. In most of the election that a problem happened, and most those who were dominant were the ones candidates by or nominated by the tribes. And even the association of Omar al-Mukhtar, the members thereof were tribal men nominated by their tribes. The World War II that destroyed Libya eliminated the role of institutions. One journalist said that he came after the war to Libya. He said that there is no state, there are no shops, no hotels. Some of the Italian palaces were destroyed, so that destroyed the institutional life in Libya, and there was a problem in Libya because we didn't have any genuine institutions that is capable of mobilizing people, and that was even worsened after the Gaddafi regime. Werner Bruce speaks about an important point, which is that Libya is continuously changing, and there is no accumulation in experience. And this is a very important point. Even in the Muslim Brotherhood, there was no accumulation of experience, and that's why as we heard from Mr. Sulaiman, there was no balance amongst people, which allows the group to mobilize people. So there were groups that were meeting here or there during the awakening, for example, in the 70s, and they were disappeared with the days of the Gaddafi in the 80s, and after they went to diaspora, they were playing the role of the opposition, and the regime itself allowed having opposition, and it was not them who made the initiative in order to be in the landscape, and that was because it served some interests for the regime, and not because there was a genuine movement that is a social movement that is allowed to work. So in brief, we can say that the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya is a social movement, at least until the revolution. After the revolution, maybe we can have a different perspective. But even if we take these elements, we don't have institutions. For example, we don't see people who know, for example, who studied in Muslim Brotherhood schools or treated in Muslim Brotherhood hospitals, or that there are companies that are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization maintained its internal culture, but it didn't have any capability to take any political opportunity. In this context, the Justice and Building Party was founded. It was a political wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they wanted to have a national partnership with others. This party, when it started to found institutions, and the experience of political parties was new in Libya. So there was in the general conference of the party, they announced the slogan, elected the leadership, and made the basic measures, and then uh, the higher council of the party was established, and we started to theorize for the party. I remember that we traveled to Jordan and we consulted with a number of partisan leadership in the world, some of them Islamic and some of them are non-Islamic, and we tried to follow the structures that are found in here or there, and we try to follow some models that represent the elites in the party, whether they were from the Muslim Brotherhood or not. And the party start to work clearly, and we start to establish institutions. This this establishment faced a number of key problems. When we started, there was a problem, or a key problem, which was the security problem. The centers of the party were attacked. There were assassinations in Benghazi, and Mr. Al-Masmari was assassinated, and the members of the party in Benghazi were accused that they were behind that. But and of course, that was false, but it created a lot of pressure on the party. This led to that the party collapsed, and the head of the party and the inner circle, they went into a hotel and they started to make decisions there. So the first founding of the party faced a very serious problem, which means that the state didn't allow the party to function appropriately. So we can find that the problems that happened were in three main issues. First, in the building of the party and or founding the party and the spreading in the area. So we or in the country, which means that we had the opportunity to work, build the steps slowly and then spread. And the other scenario that we followed was to have a general conference and to announce our slogans, and that we believe in the spread. And the numbers that we had in our perspective or in our minds wasn't didn't match the reality that we have seen. The third challenge or the third problem was the gap between the people and the Muslim Brotherhood, and between the party and the political landscape. I will speak about these three problems one after one. First, the gap between the spread and the foundation. After the momentum that we have after the election of the head of the leadership and the establishment of the leadership of the party, we felt that we can spread in in Libya, and we had 23 branches in Libya before in the beginning, even before having a budget, even before having the organizational chart. We actually that was since the beginning. We didn't have genuine institutions within the party, but there was a will for participation, and then the National General Conference or Congress came, and it encouraged us to participate. So though that was a problem by itself. When the security incident happened, which was attacking the offices of the party and its headquarters in Tripoli, the people around the party, of course, dissolved, and the only ones who remained were the elites, and they became the entire party, and we didn't have institutions. That was the a very important point in the party, which led to the collapse of the decision-making process in the party. And after a short while of that incident, I resigned from the party because the work wasn't appropriate. So the elites of the party decided to have political dealings with the reality, which means without taking into consideration the grassroots or the constituency affiliated with the party, and without the ability of the party to lead the society or the relation or how the party will be seen by its constituency. So briefly, the party preferred working in politics over the sound foundation of the party. So it considered that its presence is normal, although the conditions were not normal. A US writer, Jason Batt, said that the Libyans are trying to claim that there is no crisis in Libya, and the party got into that trap, which said that, for example, there is politics, we have other five other parties, and we need to compete, and it forgot that it doesn't have constituency actually. So we can say that the party This was one of the successes of the party. So the party continued to survive, although or despite the security threat, but it failed to establish a national party that represents all Libyans or to have any partnership in the society. And step by step or slowly, the leadership of the party started to take control over the decision, and that's something that we see everywhere in Libya. All institutions or tribes or any other bodies, they are controlled by a few number of people in the leadership rather than other people. The financial resources of the party were very limited, but later on we started, there was a flow of funds, and the party happened to it, just as what happened with the dictatorships around the world who have, for example, oil revenues. So these revenues became for the leadership of the party instead of serving the interests of the members or employing or mobilizing people around it. So the idea of the party disappeared from the minds, and the party preferred to get into the politics rather than the sound establishment of the party. The second point, which was problematic, was between the group or the party and the society, which means looking for a narrative. Despite all of our efforts to say that we are not a Muslim affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood and we are affiliated with the society, we forgot because the only narrative that
السردية الوحيدة اللي كان
the
المجتمع
only narrative that society believed in was the Muslim Brotherhood. Nobody was talking about or looking at political Islam, and we were saying that no, we are not Muslim Brotherhood. So there was confusion in the society, and the society doesn't know us because the society doesn't have representative political parties. They know us as in individuals, and even us when we were imprisoned in the 80s, people didn't know who are the Muslim Brotherhood or anything about these conflict. So that was problematic. The main idea that we had, at least myself and the group, is that we needed to start with the municipalities, with the localities, and through that they can be introduced to us through the projects or the work that we provide to them. So what we have conducted is that we started working from a Tripoli. We had a headquarters and we got some ministries, and the people start to attack us just like they attack any other party in the authority. So we moved into authority without having any societal strength depth, and that's why our we didn't match our talks, or we were saying something that doesn't apply to the people. There were continuous conflict between with the government and or competition with the government and with others, and the with other people instead of providing anything with for the society. We had five ministries. It was the electricity and the youth and the sports and the three other ministries. So they were not genuine ministries, and we were unable to make any projects that provide services for the people. The National General Congress didn't have, for the sake of interpretation, we need you to slow down. So the party didn't manage to make use of the ministries that they were responsible for. And people, of course, had that narrative that that we need to stay away from. Or actually, the ministers who were assigned, they said that we should be away from our party and from the Muslim Brotherhood. And even in the discussions, for example, we said that you got to your ministries through the party. Why you are not discussing with the party? But even the party itself didn't have any projects that are well built. So they Again, I'm saying that the political leadership became a group of political elites that want to be in the landscape, even if that was at the cost of the people and the services that they provide. And there were some problems in the rational management in the Libyan crisis. Of course, there were problems when the party got their members in the National Congress, and they were members in 5 ministries. The party should have been active and contribute to the national unity, because that is the role of the party, or should have been the role of the party, but not to have political division. So we had people who said that we want to, or we have people who were saying that we want to practice politics and we don't want to get into the complexity of this competition. And some others said, no, we need to serve people and to get to the politics slowly. So there were problems, and these problems were in decision making. There was also a problem in building the social narrative, which means in the media and the discourse and creation. And there was a problem in making alliances. For example, the decision making in the first elections after in the elections of the National Congress, which was the election of Mr. Ali Zaidan, and the party was not satisfied with the performance of Mr. Ali Zaidan at the time. There were talks about the political exclusion. Uh, that law, the party was not party to it, but it was supportive of it. And we received a call at the time from someone who said that uh, if you propose discussing that law in the National Congress, we will support you to exclude Ali Zaidan. Uh, so but we didn't do that, and we accepted to have a referendum for that, and that was understood by other parties that we want to have the exclusion of certain figures. So the party wasn't flexible enough, because the decision was made by certain individuals, and they were not surveying the ideas or the opinions of the members of the party. For example, in the Skhirat agreement, we were not represented as a party. There were figures from the party that in that party. So there is domination by certain figures in the party to make decisions, even if they don't have the capabilities to speak to people, and that it created real problems. Even when the media department within the party said that the party was, for example, taking decisions that we were not agree, we didn't agree on, and that we can't sell to people. But nobody listened to them, because the group that was in control in the party, they wanted to make decisions and control the decisions. The third one was creating alliances. This was very important in the party, because it is a political party in a problematic time. And we see that the alliances and partnerships were not built on real interests. For example, and there were uh, armed forces or armed militias in Benghazi, and they wanted to communicate with them and fight Haftar in 2014. But later in the Skhirat agreement, they lost those armed people. So and after the Skhirat, Haftar didn't commit to the meeting. So they lost Haftar, and they lost the constituency, which was supportive of them, who rejected the Skhirat agreement. So the party continued to isolate itself from the constituency that uh, found in the party someone who represents them. Uh, the party took a step towards the international community through the negotiations in Askhirat, but it lost its constituency, and that was represented in the leading elites in the party, who showed themselves to be the weak, and they were subject to their whims, their corruption, and pragmatic thinking. So if you are saying that you this is supposedly an Islamic movement or an Islamic party with an religious background, and they are dealing in a pragmatic way. So why this confusion, and why labeling themselves with that? So it is a party that is without an ideology, and that got the country into a confrontation.
مع الأزمة هي قضايا الشفافية والمسؤولية. لم يكن هناك التزام بإجراءات الحزب، يعني حدث إشكال في عقد مؤتمرات الحزب، كان فيه يعني رغبة في الاستمرار في السلطة. نعم.
In the ideas of the all of these points are clear
للانتخابات، ولم تجرى هذه الانتخابات إلا بعد ذلك عام 2021 اللي فاز فيها الأستاذ عماد البناني ب 231 لما فاز الأستاذ عماد البناني مجموعة خيبة الحزب وتركت
a main point that there were some didn't take place until after was a new party for themselves. So that shows that the measures were not well studied, and we started to get into new problems. So again, I'm saying there were problems in making the alliances. The decision making was problematic, and there was a problem with the society, in the depth in the society. I finished. I will conclude. I would say that the party was not established based on genuine constituency, and that led to a problem in the political practices, and that was coming in the context of the lack of political parties that
حزب العدالة أن يكون قريبا من
continued for over 60 years.
10 فبراير إلا
This made the party after the 7th of February, made the strategy that was followed by the leadership of the party was a survival over the needs and the interests of
على دعم العملية السياسية التي كانت تعاني من انقسامات وصراعات الأخرى. الحزب استطاع أن يكون رقما صعبا لكنه خسر.
The party was managed to get it without having a genuine institutions or ideology. It managed to become a difficult number, but it suffered from a lot of divisions in every phase until it reached this final conclusion of division through which the Democratic Party was established.
يمكن رسم منحنى مستمر من غياب الحوكمة والقرار الرشيد والرغبة في
and when a new party, and here we see a continuous lack of rational leadership.
مع أن يعني في بعض الأشياء اللي كانت ممكن فيها نيل مباشر من بعض الشخصيات، ولكن هي القصد منها إيضاح الفكرة بأن هذا الحزب لم ينشأ عن حركة اجتماعية قادرة على تأسيس مؤسسات يمكنها أن تقود البلد في مرحلة خطيرة مثل التي تعيشها ليبيا. وبارك الله فيكم.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور نزار. الدكتور نزار كان يتحدث عن النجاحات والإخفاقات لحزب العدالة والبناء. قال أن الحركة لم تنشأ كنتيجة لحركة اجتماعية متجذرة، وأن هناك شروط اجتماعية إذا فحصناها لم تتم في السياق الليبي. بدأ بحديثه عن الإطار المفاهيمي ثم تكوين الدولة الليبية. قال في الإطار المفاهيمي والإطار النظري سأل هل الإخوان حركة اجتماعية نشأت من خلال الحراك الاجتماعي في داخل المجتمع الليبي؟ ثم بالنسبة لتكوين الدولة الليبية قال هل يسمح تكوين هذه الدولة بتكون حركة اجتماعية؟ ثم قال أن الإخفاقات على الحزب.
So Mr. Nizar said that there was a problem in the establishment of this party,
زعامات أو نخب زعامية، وأن هذا
and that the party
وقال أنه كان جزء من هذه التجربة
of leaders, and this is very important, that the experience in some parts were very key, and he said that he wanted to make an
لأن هذه الشروط تساعد على
He talked about the conditions of this movement because they influence its ability to survive within the community, that any human community has a purpose, organizational framework, human resources, as well as historical context. And this differs from one geographical context to the other. And he gave an example by Hassan al-Banna that Hassan al-Banna had the conditions after the fall of the caliphate, and other examples. The fourth, after the opportunity, was the presence of internal culture, that there was no culture within the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood, and the influence, their influence was limited. And the fifth was the ability of social mobilization. Their abilities or capacities were rather limited. They did not have the institutions through which they would thrive and spread. And this lack of institutions was not about only for the Muslim Brotherhood, but in Libya in general. The state was in charge of those bigger institutions, and that most movements in Libya emerged outside Libya, and that there was a tribal mindset, and that during the administrative problems even accumulated even further, and there was not much accumulation of experience by the Muslim Brotherhood during those decades, but actually it was the regime that gave the Muslim Brotherhood the chance to exist in the community. The Muslim Brotherhood was not a social movement until the revolution. The organization was captive to its internal organizational structure and was unable to mobilize communities until the revolution. But after that, it started to issue its own regulations and benefit from other experiences. And this emerging movement or political party learned from other countries' experiences and represented the elites of the Muslim Brotherhood. However, its foundation was rather fragile, and it dissolved and came under the monopoly of the few. There were some issues with the building of this party, that this party was based on a certain vision but failed to spread socially. The other issue is its connection to the social context, and then its political access. This party was widespread, however, it was unable to face up to challenges. Its new elite started to act politically without taking into consideration its lack of capacity for social mobilization and political action. So it preferred political action to social mobilization. It started to be engaged in politics, divided internally without spreading within the society. And we had the spread of personal leaders instead of institutions. The other challenge was related to financial resources, because there were many resources from abroad. Hence, there was some control of the decision by the leaders who contributed those external funds. Also, the narrative was not so convincing. It was the narrative of the Muslim Brotherhood, but the party tried to create a distance between itself and the Muslim Brotherhood, but its new narrative was not convincing for the society, particularly with its political reaction. There were other adverse effects by the opposition to the Islamic movement. movement or the party was unable to provide any party with its own school of thought. Even the ministers who would represent the party said they did not represent the party or the Islamic movement, so they did not represent a social movement. The other issue was how they dealt with the political crisis, because the party had 5 ministries at some point. They could have introduced their political program, but they had threefold problems. First was decision-making mechanisms. The second was related to social narratives, related to their political narrative, as they were unable to reach to people's hearts. And the third was failure to establish strategic alliances, i.e. alliances were not correctly figured, which made them lose some constituency. The party approached some others internationally, but it lost its local constituency. Some leaders of what some of its leaders said in terms of it not having an Islamic background was rather problematic for the people, and also lack of a transparency was problematic, particularly when it came to the elections, which ended up with internal division into 2 parties, the Building and Justice Party and the other party. So ultimately, they gave preference to political action at the expense of its social expansion. They lost much of their constituency. He says this was an objective analysis of the Libyan experience and the Islamic movement there. Thank you. We move now to Dr. Majda Al-Fallah, the political movement in Libya, prospects and lessons learned. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, peace and blessings be upon Prophet Muhammad and his companions. First of all, I would like to salute all of those present in this symposium and thank the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, particularly Dr. Sami Al-Arian, for giving me this opportunity to take part in this symposium, which I believe is very important in terms of accumulating experience, in terms of the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood in a state where this experience is rather nascent. Actually, the issue of lessons learned is important, as we have 10 years of lack of political and security stability, and in which we lacked the time to pause, to reevaluate the political activity of this nascent experience. So this becomes very important in order to learn from this experience. And in this paper, I tried to outline the experience, although I think it requires further nuanced discussion, particularly based on interaction with members of the party and leaders of the party, in order to come about with an overall assessment of the party, a forward-looking assessment of this experience. I tried, but I actually would make use of Mr. Nizar's and Mr. Abu Bakr's introduction, because all the things they mentioned lay the foundation for what I would present in this paper in terms of the lessons learned that we have to make use of as a founding member of this party and one of its nominee for the National Congress candidates. And I also took part in the Geneva dialogue. So since the establishment of this party, I lived through this experience and the multiple milestones that it went through. And this paper works on 3 different levels, which I believe, since I am a physician by profession, I tried to dissect this issue, which is what are the lessons at the professional level and what are the lessons at the political level, and what's the future of this party and how can it be built, or how can we fulfill our aspirations for a future in which we make use of the lessons we learned over the past decades. On the structural level, I started from the most important milestone, which is the decision by the Muslim Brotherhood group or movement in its 9th conference in 2011, in which they decided to establish a party, a political party that's independent from the Muslim Brotherhood in all means, because and this is something that stands out about the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya, different from Muslim Brotherhood in other countries, particularly in the context of a revolution, the separation of the political from the dawah aspects, particularly with the lack of constituency in Libya. This was an interesting choice, which is opening up to the other, disconnecting or dissociating dawah from the political action and not linking this political institution to the history of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, because we know the dawah has its own tools, while politics have different tools. Before the revolution, we had a military dictatorship with a complete absence of a civilian state and a complete lack of plurality and a total absence of civil society institutions and even of culture and deliberations, because it was an autocracy. So the public support for this party gave it a push at the beginning. It was the only political party in which its founding conference included more than 1,000 members, men and women, and many people were so keen on affiliating, so much so that it reached to 15,000 members in no time. And by this, it also secured a network of local and international relations through which it was able to secure some funding and to benefit from the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood in other states as well. However, lack of complete coordination in decisive decisions with the complete independence from the mother movement and the caused or gave rise to a media campaign, an assault, particularly in 2013. It was actually backed regionally against this party and against the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and it was branded as the political branch or the political arm of the Muslim Brotherhoods, and this separation was not convincing for the society, and the movement had to review its decision about separating itself from the political party and to ask whether this separation was timely and well informed, or whether this was a failed attempt or would require at least some sort of development or re-evaluation. Of course, this separation and branding the party as closely associated with the Muslim Brotherhood was one of the issues that fed into the the massive division in the recent leadership, where the former leader of the party dissented from the main body of the party, with many of the personnel and staff of the party to establish an independent party, totally independent from the Muslim Brotherhood, actually introducing a new condition for the membership into our affiliation with a new party of being not a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. So making this a condition to affiliate with the new democratic party. So I believe the da'wah and the political aspects are different but complementary, and those alliances are important for politicians to communicate with civil society institutions and to start alliances at certain points. And we know that the movement has now become licensed as a civil society organization. This is in terms of separating between dawah and politics. The other issue in structural terms was partnership in foundation. It was a strategic option, which is opening the floor from the very beginning, from the moment of establishing this nascent political institution. Libyans decided that they would engage others from outside the group or the movement in establishing this group or this party, and they introduced a number of conditions to and created a number of conditions, including the founding conference and other conferences, in which they provided as a condition that 40% of the attendees would be from outside the Muslim Brotherhood. But this partnership witnessed a number of setbacks that only emerged in practice, which is the gap in terms of capacities between the Muslim Brotherhood leaders who affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood as individuals who wanted to manage and lead versus other national Libyans whose education was restricted by the Libyan autocracy that created a mentality that was resistant to change, lacking flexibility and lacking vision in terms of the aspired state, in comparison with the Muslim Brotherhood movement, which used to work on building the capacity of its members at different levels in order to keep abreast with the rest of the world. And this discrepancy was not recognized or was not preempted by the leadership of the party by building the capacity of those other members in order to bridge this gap, this capacity gap. So some individuals or some figures in the leadership of the party felt that Muslim Brotherhood figures were more prominent and were monopolizing power within the party, In addition, of course, to the media campaign that described or branded the party as the political arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that it would not use the title the justice and construction, the justice and building, but the Muslim Brotherhood Party pushing many to actually resign from the Muslim Brotherhood or from the party. This partnership that the Muslim Brotherhood tried to effect was not convincing for the Libyan people. That's probably because of the lack of constituency, because the group did not have a broad constituency, particularly that many of its members were in exile or migrated earlier because of the oppression. So this partnership was not convincing, and this party remained branded as the Muslim Brotherhood Party, although the movement itself was working very hard on ensuring the independence of this party at all levels. The third point that I believe is important now, after 10 years, I believe that declaring the fact that your background or point of reference was Islamic, particularly in a community where you don't have as various sects or diversity in religious composition, and at the same time with the lack of political parties that are ideological, and with a community or society that is not too familiar with political practice, the question arises as whether it was right for the Muslim Brotherhood to choose to brand itself with that point of reference, or was it important to refrain from that and to highlight the plurality, etc. But particularly engaging this ideological aspect with the having in the background the idea about the Muslim Brotherhood with the media campaign actually gave the party a bad reputation, as though this party was trying to lead the community against its will, and sometimes it was said to be affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And of course, the Egyptian media itself affects the Libyan people because there is much engagement between the two societies. At some point, Libyans always would follow the Egyptian media rather than Libyan because of the absence of appropriate Libyan media. So there is a lot of influence on the Libyan community from the Egyptian media. So at some point, under this media assault or media campaign, and with the keenness of this party to take the lead, it affected its future prospects, particularly with the lack of political and security stability. So the party was subject to a number of attacks and vandalism to its offices as a party that was affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, particularly after the military coup in Egypt. My point of view is that Libya does not know any point of reference apart from the Islamic point of reference. So unlike probably some of its neighbors, the Libyan society is rather religious, and at the same time it was taking its baby steps in terms of its political practice and political life. So probably the party would have rather obliged itself with the Islamic point of reference in its programming and its work without using that banner theoretically given the Libyan context. One of the indicators of this situation was this division within the ranks of the party and the emergence of a new party from within its ranks, and that new party quickly declared that it had no ideology, it was not ideological, and it does not welcome any members who are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So they dissociated themselves from the Muslim Brotherhood, and this needs to be considered quite closely. I'm trying to be brief because I'm still in the structural level.
تغليب البقاء في المشهد على المأسسة داخل الحزب نحن منذ تأسيس.
So to speak about the structure of the party, since we founded our party on the 2nd of March, 4 months later, the first legislative elections took place in Libya, and the party decided to participate in the elections.
في الانتخابات بمرشحين اختارهم طبعا نتيجة لقصر الوقت
with candidates, and because of the short time that we had, it was a quick procedure, and we were racing against time. The party ranked second with 17 seats, as well as a number of seats who were on the individuals lists. The list, the party was distinguished in its performance, and we will speak about that when the time comes. Afterwards, political crises came one after another, and the party dealt with each crisis, and they didn't focus on the internal decision-making processes or the organizational structure or the internal crisis, because it didn't have time after they got into the elections. Because once they got into the elections, the institutionalization within the party was less important, and the party focused more on the unifying the fabric of the state, because we were in a critical moment. And we felt that we need to have a united front. Accordingly, there were some inclinations within the party, and there were divisions in the last, or the divisions were crystallized and were obvious in the last conference that the party had. We didn't have for example, charismatic people like our neighbors in the east and the west, Egypt and Tunisia, because of the dictatorship that and the totalitarian regime that we had in Libya. And the tribal leadership was more influential, and we had more divisions. At the same time, the party didn't improve its cadres in order to have the human resources that can be improved in the political landscape in Libya. The importance of the decision making within the party, according to the bylaws. So according to the bylaws of the executive office, the the head of the party leads the executive office, but the higher council is the one that sets the policy and and monitor the performance. And I believe that there was confusion between the legislative and the executive, or the higher council and the executive office, because the head of the party selected some of the members in the higher council to be members in the executive office, and that uh, weakened the monitoring role of the council a little, and allowed the head of the party to work freely uh, to expand on making more decisions, or the lack of expanding the decision making circles. Some of the most important points of the party, which is the participation or the contribution of the party in the political landscape, it was out of the keenness of the party to be part of the political landscape, but that wasn't accompanied with clear projects, tools available, and cadres capable of matching the level of being in governance or in decision-making circles. I'm one of the members or the representatives on behalf of the Justice and Building Party. When we got into the National Congress, the party should have developed projects or clear projects for the important matters in the state building after the revolution. For example, in the constitutional a project that was the constituent assembly, and we should have our input whether to do or to go through elections, or to have our input in that decision. The issue of building the army and the police, especially that we are working or we're talking about an armed state, and we had a lot of militias, and and any integration of the militias in the
العزل
police or in the army will not lead to stability.
السياسي
The political exclusion army, the reconciliation, and the establishment of the government. All of these files, the party participated in these matters without without preparation or without employment of the cadres of the party in these matters. The party since establishment had 23 or 24 centers, and the membership list was the largest amongst the other parties. Dr. Majida, you have 5 minutes left. Okay, I will conclude in 5 minutes. Thank you. In terms of participation in the governance and to survive or to remain in the political landscape, the Justice and Building Party participated, but it didn't rule. We participated in 5 ministers and deputy prime minister who got into fights and without the knowledge of the head of the party, and the 5 ministries we were unable to have a project to convince the society. So our keenness to be part of the landscape was more than having genuine projects to work on. Uh, so the party didn't make sound decisions in that field. Of course, staying in the government made a division in the party after the head of the party signed on the fourth revision document without having enough consultations within the party, and they were taking sides. And that was one of the phases in which the party took part strongly, and it dealt with the matter pragmatically, but it the failure was in not involving the lower levels of the membership of the party in the decision making of the choices of the party. The fourth point was dealing with the media performance. We didn't pay attention to media. We didn't learn from the Egyptian experience how, by the use of media, the coup managed to eliminate the Egyptian revolution, and we still have a problem in that field in all of the Islamic movements, I believe, and hadn't and if those movements or if those Islamic movements don't work hard on media, they will fail in their work. And the division that happened in the party was employed wrongfully in the infights in the party, which led to the split of the party. And instead of using that in order to make projects that can convince the people and represent people genuinely, the competition, the conflict with other parties was also a factor, because the weakness of other parties made the Justice and Building Party be more keen to have a presence in the political landscape. I believe that we need to have a real revision of the practice and this experience, and to have to strike a balance between the theoretical work and the practice in politics, or instead of uh, uh, putting these issues aside. And the party needs to built on the values that it is based on, like democracy, morals, and freedom, and to strike a balance with a pragmatic action that is doing in order to respond to the events, which means it should not abandon the values in order to remain in power. Ideology doesn't have any influence now, and the citizens now need to see projects that meet their ambitions and their needs. We need to have a rational leadership that make decisions appropriately, and that is strong. We need the use of soft power in order to confront the media attacks and to promote our projects. Finally, the Justice and Building a Party started strong. It made some partnerships. It was based on background, but this reliance on the terms of reference made it easy for it to be accused of being affiliated with other bodies, and it preferred to build alliances and to be introduced to the international community over being solid within. And I believe one of the lessons that we need to learn, or the party needs to learn from the past period, is to learn from the experience that they had and to know its genuine sides. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Majida. Dr. Majida spoke in her presentation that there are plenty of lessons that we can learn after 10 years. taken into consideration that, that we still don't have any political and security stability for this unique experience. She provided headlines and that needs the in-depth analysis in order to learn from the lessons. And she said that the party, she was a member in the party in the higher council and even in the Geneva process. So she wanted to talk about the three different levels. The first one about the structure after the establishment of the party in 2011, which was completely separate from the movement, and that was an early experience of other movements that separated the Dawah from the political wing since the beginning, and that proves that there was a genuine intention to openness towards the other, and that the party was not linked with the Muslim Brotherhood. Before the revolution, of course, there was a dictatorship in which there was lack of freedom and liberty, and the party came to filled that gap, and this since the beginning it or it benefited from linking with the Muslim Brotherhood from the financial resources, but at the same time there was lack of coordination between what is the movement and what is the party because of the independence that it was working in. There was a regional attack, especially after 2013 and 2014 in Egypt, and she was saying that there might time in order to she asked a question, was that a chapter correct, or the experience shows that it was a problem that it should be reviewed. She said that the party had an experience with the Democratic Party, and she said that the Dawah or the activity in Dawah might be useful for working in politics, and it can be used for to communicate with civil society and the society at large. In the structure, she said that since foundation, that there was as a strategic decision that it will be open to the others and to the society and to establish partnerships to have technical experience. So this networks had some negative aspects, and she said that the difference in capabilities between the Muslim Brotherhood who were in the party and others from the democratic parties didn't have that capabilities, whether in terms of the thought or the practice. So the party didn't work on building these capacities and the capacities of those who were affiliated with it. There was a feeling, or some people felt at the time that there was monopoly of the leadership, and there were
أو حتى في داخل الجماعة
campaigns of smear campaigns of some of the leadership. Anyway, even this partnership was not convincing for the Libyan society, despite the effort made by the group. The group or the movement was working independently from the party, and there was the other question she asks about the context of the Islamic terms of reference in the Libyan context. So there was no Islamic or religious parties in Libya, so that context of mentioning the Islamic terms of reference was received negatively on the party. She says that the party was not affiliated in the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya, but it was affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And because of the media campaigns that was coordinated, this respect or this prospect was stronger in the minds of the people. Libya doesn't know anything other than the Islamic terms of reference, that, and it is a conservative or than a religious society by nature, and it should have sufficed by the context that were available in the context. She said that the Democratic party that says it is not an ideological one, and that it doesn't welcome any ideological person with it, maybe a reaction to the party. She said that the winning of the in the first elections was good, and it became part of the problem and they didn't work on, or the party didn't work on the internal building or the internal structure because they got busy with the political matters. She said that the party lacks charismatic personalities, and the party didn't use this period to build new figures in the society and in the party. At the level of decision making, she said that the party, the head of the party was was leading the executive office, but there was confusion between the executive and the monitoring roles of the higher council, so the decisions weren't monitored. At the political level, the party wanted to be in the political landscape, but without projects that were clear. And she gave a number of examples, like, for example, building the army and the police, is the establishment of the government. And she said that there were problems within the party. The party maybe participated in in governance, but it didn't govern actually, and there were structural problems, and that there were problems with the head of the party and others, for example. And she mentioned as Khairat agreement that it wasn't a good decision to make, and it led to divisions. She also mentioned dealing with the media, that it was weak, and that and the movement or the party didn't benefit from the lessons learned from Egypt. The media was used negatively in the infights within the party, and because of the weakness of the competing of other parties, negatively reflected on the party. This issue requires in-depth review after what happened, which means that we need to learn or to study the experience. The party needs to rely on the soft power and the use of media, and to have a strong political start that will give a model for political partnership. In terms of the question of terms of reference, it should be restudied, because this made it easy to accuse the party of being affiliated with other bodies, and preferring international relations with the internal structure or constituency. All of that requires more in-depth study. Thank you very much, and the time is passing very quickly. Right now we will have two comments. The first one will be by Dr. Khairi Omar, and the second one will be by Mr. Dr. Muhammad Umaish, and then I will give you each one of you, the speakers, 4 minutes to comment on the comments. Dr. Khairi Omar, the floor is yours. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most bountiful, I would like to thank the speakers. And I believe that the presentations that were made in this session, each one of the presentation requires a lengthy discussion, because we can ask the question again, which is, how can we reread the experience from its beginning, which can help the re-establishing or the relaunching of the experience again. I have 3 levels of discussion. The first point is about the revolution, and the second is, or the revolutionary aspect. The second is the modern aspect, modernizing, and the third is the ability to adapt to political changes in the surrounding environment. The first point, when she talked about the roots of the Islamic movement in Libya, the question here is on 2 points. The first point is about the starting point, and the issue of a development. Of course, the development speaks negatively how things happen, or in a narrative, how things happen and how it improved without getting into the details. The second point is the justification, which means why this happened and not something else happened. Why, for example, there were no why there is no impact in the political landscape in Syria, and whether
why
it
there
is
is no
because
impact
of
in
different
the
problems or
political
because the political project wasn't
أو والأحزاب القريبة منها كيف نظرت لعلاقتها بالدولة أو كيف نظرت لعلاقتها بالثورة.
whether
هذه الأسئلة إذا لم يكن التصدي لها واعيا قديرا فإننا سوف تتناسى الأخطاء أو تتراجع أو تنسخ الأخطاء أو القصور.
problems or because the political project wasn't
يطيب لي أن أشير إلى
clear enough, especially that and because of what happened to the Muslim Brotherhood and how
وطنية وكيف تشكلت في بداية في عشرينيات القرن الماضي
وكيف to understand or to learn the shortcomings when we
السياسية والتعثر الدستوري
of the national
يعني دارت الأمور أو تقف عند نقطة معينة دون أن تنطلق إلى نقطة أخرى. الدولة الموحدة والمؤسسات السياسية مختلفا كما طرحه القذافي. يعني على سبيل المثال أن
And when we speak about the political participation and the ideas that were provided by Al-Qaddafi, I believe that it will be a useful way to approach the current problems. For example, speaking about the constitutional problem, and can we consider these problems serious problems, or is it just something in the political mindset, and why there were no discussions on that point? This point, I believe, is related to another issue. When the Muslim Brotherhood was established, and it continued to be for a long time a secret movement, how it started and how the Al-Qaddafi started in the West. What did the Muslim Brotherhood worked with Al-Qaddafi or not? So I believe the relation with this state, the movement could have benefited from in post 2011. In 2006, there was a move. There was a statement that members of the Muslim Brotherhood were with the revolution, regardless how or without having any project, and this doesn't show, and this shows that there is no clear vision how the political transition is taking place in the within the party, and without having any political context that allows it to make its decisions. So, for example, how was the relation of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Justice and Building Party with the revolutionary forces, especially the martyrs or the families, martyrs' families? And this is a current that was supported by the independent, and it managed to influence the landscape. The minority groups was the one that controlled the parliament, and it was the one that was provided the critical decisions, and they were more extremist in a way or another. For example, the political exclusion was a reaction to what happened with the government of Ali Zaidan, and before before that, there were the disputes with the constitutional amendments and other points. I will conclude this point that the Muslim Brotherhood movement and the Justice and Building Party wasn't a developing movement, but rather a division that will not reach the end of the development process. And to look into the causes, it's not to the point to look into the causes, but there were problems in the current movement and in the alliance
Omar, you are in
it was seen that
Arabic channel. We hear you. تفضل دكتور خيري.
أنه أصدر بيانا في 12 إبريل 2013 بعد تذكرة العزل السياسي.
there was a statement in conclusion that it was not concerned with the political
السياسيين في ليبيا واعتبروها نوعا من الهزل. وأيضا أن خليفة حفتر أعلن مشروعه العسكري أو مشروعه العسكري السياسي في 30 يونيو 2000. هذه التحولات أعتقد أنها مفصلية وأسست للانقسام، ولم تكن هناك الصوت عند من؟
نسمعك تفضل.
طيب وأنه لم يكن هناك وعي بأن هذه المؤشرات هي بداية الخلاف حول المسار السياسي في ليبيا، وبعدها ظهرت الكثير من المبادرات السياسية والتي كانت ذروتها في انهيار أو تفكيك المؤتمر الوطني العام ووجود مجلس النواب. وبالتالي هنا
Khalifa Haftar announced his military political
تستطيع عملية
mission.
أيضا عندما شاركت في الانتقال السياسي بعد 2011
and institutional development after in the political transition after 2011, and it couldn't make any of the democratic changes that happened. So we need to see how we can learn that or how we can learn the causes of that. So I believe in the case of Libya, it's not a precondition that the party should be widely spread or a popular movement, because it is coming after the unity of the General National Congress, and it was the only the Jamahiriya in the world. So the question is that how can we fill the gap or the vacuum, because the Libyan Jamahiri regime or popularist regime was not established in any other country. So how can we manage it? And on the contrary, there was no strong document that was issued by the February forces or the February Revolution, how to correct that track. So the establishment of the General National Congress, it was considered that it will be the solution for all problems, but it didn't. The problem of the about modernity or modernization and the obstacles.
There is a lot of debate about the weaknesses in institutions or lack of a political vision, or that the political vision was not up to the historical moments. Hence, when we talk about modernization and development, and we attribute this to external factors, I think that's misplaced. What is the point of blaming external factors on institutional structural issues? When Mr. Nizar pointed out the problem of the external factors, I believe this can be accepted in certain problems, but we talk about the aptitude or the ability to accept capacities or resources from outside the movement, then the issue of independence becomes questionable, not only in terms of the political party, but the political movement
واختلاف في الرؤية، لكنه انقسام على
as
المؤسسين
a whole.
أو خلاف السيطرة أو
But
الخلاف المالي أو غيره، فإن هذا هنا يكون معيبا، وأن العيب لا يرجع للعوامل الخارجية بقدر ما أنه
because this points out some internal structural problems rather than external factors. Those who are well known in the movement in Egypt are well known across the board, not only to the elite in the state. So the contribution of external factors to such frustration of development needs to be reconsidered, particularly when it comes to what has come to be known as counter-revolution, because the main issue was lack of consensus among the parties as to their reading of the historical moment, and the debate between the National Congress and other parties was not because of external factors, but because of miscommunication between the parties themselves. While didn't they work on overcoming those political disagreements until 2014, when it was overruled altogether the existing political order. At the institutional or organizational level, I believe the Muslim Brotherhood and the Justice and Building Party had a relationship that wasn't completely mature. And I'm not here about to give examples, but ultimately, their ultimate impact was lack of clarity on how the February Revolution would move forward. So the main issue was the debate that was lacking between the Libyan parties themselves on how to move from point A to point Z. And also another example is all the factors that played into the failure of the National Congress, be it there were some blocks such as Al-Qaqa and Al-Wafa' lil-Shuhada, and breaking into the parliament, their focus on the monopoly of the parliament played into that frustration. So the National Congress mutually weakened one another, actually. That's in terms of development, but there is an overlap actually between the different comments or points I wanted to make. The final point I wanted to make was in relation to the question of whether there had been an opportunity that would have saved a lot of efforts in the February Revolution if all the movements mobilized all of their internal capacities. I believe that was possible in the first 2 years, as the society was completely free and movements and parties were working without internal pressure, at least until the end of 2013. And during that year and a half, there were no indications that that opportunity was seized in terms of providing leadership, moving towards institutionalization, or producing a political project. I was following during that period between March 2013 until September 2014, and I noticed that there was a kind of that the revolutionary forces were moving from the status of defense to surrender, and this was translated into lack of unity among political leaders towards a specific objective. Was this fragmentation the fault of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Justice and Building Party? I believe the main point was that they failed to provide or take up the role that is decisive in order to find the common denominator between all the parties. This is what I wanted to say. So the current problem, I believe, the Justice and Building Party will have minimal contribution or ability to affect because of the multiplicity of parties and because of the international intervention, which is going to prevent self-determination by Libyans. And when Mr. Abu Bakr talked about international equilibrium, I believe that in such crises, international equilibrium cannot be reached. So actually international rivalry or competition continues or even escalates into a conflict, which is going to constitute a problem. So unless a consensus is reached, the outside world is going to take over. Now I give the floor to our last commentator, Dr. Muhammad. Peace be upon you all. Peace be Muhammad Umesh. Can you hear me? Yes, I thank SIGA and Dr. Sami Al-Aryan for this invitation to take part and comment on this symposium. And I would like to welcome and greet all the speakers, Dr. Majda, Dr. Khairi, Dr. Abu Bakr, and Dr. Nizar for their contributions to this symposium. I would like to avoid repetition, but I will talk about a point that some of you have mentioned quickly and others skipped altogether, not believing it was significant. I believe the golden age, sorry, how long do I have? How much time do I have? How much do you need? 15? Well, 15 maximum, 12 to 15. The question of the revolution based on the political context that Mr. Nizar explained in social and historical terms, and how political and social action can take place in any context. I agree with him, given that his assumptions were based on sociological theory. But I believe that what is missing for the Libyans is understanding this and developing an action plan or an active theory that could overcome that historical context in order to introduce new venues for action. The other point is the question of the counter-revolution, which I would like to consider for some time, because the golden years are in modern Libyan history were between the revolution to 1 year after the election of the National Congress. Those were the golden years in commercial political consensus terms, and everybody had many hopes, so much so that many of those expatriates came back to Libya to start to re-establish their lives there. Things were very lively and all of a sudden the situation fell or had a free fall, causing quite a shock for the Libyans themselves, particularly the expatriates, the residents, as well as the observers who believe in people's rights to liberty and human rights. I was in Tripoli during the revolution, and I coordinated the coalition in the 17th of February, and we were in contact with everyone, and we were looking at who would support us in the Arab region, and we thought that everyone had joined our ranks because they believed in the Libyan people and their right to liberate themselves from tyranny. But during the National Congress and the ensuing chaos, we were surprised, but we were told that we were only taking our baby steps in democracy and democratic practice. But when we had the Fajr Libya, or the Libyan Dawn process operation, and there were the breaking into the parliament by the military factions that were countering the National Congress, they did find documents that proved the some of the violations that with which the National Congress was supported or accused, sorry, and documents were found to show that those military factions were supported by regional powers. So based on that, when we looked in hindsight and tried to analyze the situation, we found that it was a premeditated action for those people to have influence and to grow influence on certain groups in order to use them and mobilize them at certain decisive points. What made Libyans more prone to those problems was the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood regime in Egypt. So this counter-revolution effect needs to be studied and understood. When the revolution started and we were involved in it, I personally remember that I collected materials about what I called the counter-revolution, but at the time we had no time to come up with outcomes and analysis, etc. So I believe that it's important to raise awareness among young people and new party members to be aware of those issues, because you want people to understand the positive political action, but also be aware and recognize the counter revolutionary and rival politics. So for people to understand the phases of a revolution and the challenges to which a revolution is prone would have made people more prepared to face up to those challenges. Because after the revolution, for ourselves, we were moving forward without knowing what to expect and where we're moving. We didn't know what would be our fate if we fail and what would be the prospect if we succeed in the revolution. And this is what we saw practically after the success of the revolution, which is that we had a complete absence of institutions, of the state institutions. For a month after the revolution, Tripoli was totally without institutions, which exposed the backwardness which the regime has made inherent within the Libyan state. So what I'm trying to say is that those factors that would sabotage any political action or any revolution need to be understood and analyzed, because they persist and could sabotage any revolution or political action in any Arab country. Another point based on what Dr. Majida mentioned in terms of the separation between the da'wah aspect and the political aspect, I would agree with her that the Muslim Brotherhood were open to partners in establishing a political party that does not speak for the Muslim Brotherhood. That was a great step, but it wasn't enough. It would have required a support system, so to speak. In other words, the Muslim Brotherhood, when they worked on this, they neglected the da'wah aspect. Hence, we had some ideas that were not with the moderate view of the Muslim Brotherhood, so much so that they became armed factions recruited in the interest of and in favor of some regional powers. So yes, this separation was in itself a success, but it would require development in order to support the da'wah aspect in order for it to continue. And of course, I agree with you that we wouldn't have needed to mention the issue of the Islam as the point of reference, because the Libyan society is Sunni Muslim, more or less homogeneous, but people would look behind, always inspect the sources of those parties and the ideology. The weight given and regard given to the Justice and Building Party was not because of certain people and figures, but because of the idea behind this party. The idea was the Muslim Brotherhood. So it was based on that idea, although not organizationally, but this idea was its source of strength. And disowning this idea would be counterproductive and would weaken or water down the political party unless it provides or secures social constituency and the presence within the social ranks and the parliamentarian blocks. So the reality of every party would appear in this case in the number of members in parliament of that party. I also believe that the mistakes, and I wouldn't say the mistakes, some of them are based on the pressure because of the counter-revolution. Mr. Mahmoud Jibril, may he rest in peace, was under much pressure, and he was from regional leaders, and he was concerned that even a photograph leaked of his meeting with the Justice and Building Party would cause him trouble. That's why some of the failure within the National Congress were because of those pressures on Mr. Mahmoud Jibril, and before the Zaidan government, there was supposed to be a coalition or an alliance with the Party of Justice and Building in order to establish a national unity government amongst themselves, and this would have been better than this disagreement that gave rise to the Zaidan government and who was able to use the divide and rule principle. One of the gravest mistakes made by the Justice and Building Party was not failure to engaging the revolutionary people internally within its ranks in decisive decisions, particularly in Al-Khairat agreement, which caused deep division, followed by many more, but that was the source of all division, in which I agree with the signing the Al-Khairat agreement because I believe otherwise Al-Khairat agreement was supposed to exclude the Islamists. So I believe and because the Justice and Building Party signed, the counter-revolution forces dismantled or did not honor this Khairat agreement. And there is also, I believe, one of the other problems was the dissolution of any Libyan leadership with the when the judiciary was not consulted and when the parliament was dissolved, giving the upper hand to foreigners rather than Libyans. And foreigners started to be the ones who are leading the agreements or the consensus, and Libyans lacked any body or organizational structure that would lead or coordinate. Also, I believe we need public awareness. Libyans lived for a long time under the monarchy and under al-Qaddafi in exclusion or incrimination of political work. As al-Qaddafi said that those who affiliate with political parties are traitors, and he countered democracy, etc. So this democracy has to be a dynamic, not only in political terms, but also within the ranks of the parties and within social dynamics as well, in order to become inherent in the culture. The final point I would like to make, maybe the role that is required from the Justice and Building Party is for it to become a national inclusive party. If the party manages to take up that role, we will find that it would pave the way for a better future, God willing. Thank you so much, Dr. Muhammad. Now we go to the final section of this symposium, giving the floor to all our speakers for any final comments. Mr. Sulaiman, thank you, everyone. Because of the lack of time, I would summarize saying that I agree with Dr. Muhammad Omeish that this evaluation of the Justice and Building Party without regard to the counter-revolution would be arbitrary, because the revolution has, or the counter-revolution has toppled an established movement in Egypt and imprisoned its leaders. So it is important to factor in those issues. And unfortunately, there is a kind of idealism in the approach to considering some of the events. Time does not allow right now, but there were points in which that were played down as although there were clear indicators that there was a counter-revolution and it was a repetition or another version from what happened in Egypt, aiming at reinstituting tyranny in one way or another. As I mentioned, playing down those indicators and dealing in an idealistic manner as though you are in a community that has always been democratic, etc., forgetting that this is a community that has just emerged from decades of tyranny, and that societies that are formed within that context would inevitably be influenced in terms of their unconscious and their inherent culture with tyranny, so they would fall into the same pitfalls again. The other issue is the ability to read into the past or the future. I believe there has been some superficial reading. This is related to geopolitics. We have to understand the position of Libya in this geopolitical context, after which we can identify the different courses of action, because parties have courses of action. They are not think tanks for strategic studies. Strategic studies can be done by study centers, but the parties have the function of making use of those studies in introducing tactics to different positions or different situations. Hence, the geopolitics has to be present and factored into the vision of the Justice and Building Party. As for the history, I still believe, and I hope that I will have the chance to discuss this with Dr. Khairi further, even on a personal level, there is truly a question about Libya in a country where we had a constitutional monarchy and emerging from a war, etc. Where were the Muslim Brotherhood in establishing the civil state under the constitutional monarchy for this to emerge as a popular option? I'm not sure I can account for this gap in the history of the Muslim Brotherhood. To conclude, in terms of evaluating this experience, I took part in the elections, and I was one of the what Dr. Nizar mentioned was not quite accurate, and the establishment of the Democratic Party to put this, that this was due to the emergence of one party, so they started the other because the other party succeeded in those elections. I believe the right question is that, were there any interventions in those elections? To be quite frank, has the Muslim Brotherhood been intervening in the elections? And I have evidence for that. Also, this division then has to be seen in light of the facts rather than to be depicted as a reaction towards the emergence or the success of others in elections. So, to conclude, the question, is it wise for a small group emerging from a community that has lived under tyranny, was it wise for it to separate its resources and split its resources and its capacities between two branches of the Dawah and the political, and not mobilize those capacities for its new ends? Already they were a small group. Was it wise to divide the resources and create this competition between the two blocks? I believe that to mention this in passing, saying that this separation was decisive and important, I believe we need to look at this in terms of the available capacities and resources. Did we truly have the luxury of resources to split them and create two competing blocks? I believe this needs to be reviewed. Thank you so much, Mr. Sulaiman Abdul Qadir. And now the floor is to Mr. Abu Bakr. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad, Dr. Khairi. God bless you. When we talk about the national project and the revolutionary project, undoubtedly, if the opportunity was ripe for a national project, then this would be the choice to go with rather than the international project. But in the Libyan context, in which we had years of armed conflict and lack of trust between the factions or the parties, this makes it necessary to reassess reality and engage with the parties and the international parties that are involved and see what interests are in place to reach a formula that serves both international and Libyan interests. This is what I wanted to say in comment of those remarks. Thank you so much, Dr. Nizar. The floor is yours. Actually, I don't have much more to say. I don't believe I heard comments about the essence of my paper, but there are 2 points I wanted to assert. I believe that Libya, and I have wrote about Libya and about political Islam. Libya not only was ruled by anarchy, but not in a phony manner, but in a real profound manner. And I believe that this is quite a singularity to make anarchy a mode of governance. And I believe this was mentioned by Eric Deutschmann, a German historian. He said that Libya will not move from anarchy to democracy, but it would move from anarchy to anocracy, which is lack of governance altogether, because the outcome of this anarchy is our inability to establish genuine institutions. I remember some people who said that what is important is to have parties in this state, to have a state, but the type of state is not important. But that's not something we were able to have. I'm not talking about the last elections, but I'm talking about the ratio of dropouts from the party. You will find that the graph is going down of the number of members and even the leaders, whether you call it dissent or something else. Ultimately, in governance, we look at outcomes. They have left the party. The outcome is that the number of people are dropping out from the party. They are growing, so much so that you now have ended up with two parties who are looking for their own identities. Ultimately, and I would like to point out that after the National Congress, we had a conference in order to assess the work of the party. You would find that people are talking about the reasons and not the outcomes. The issue of counter-revolution, I believe this is not an accurate term in the first place historically, but I believe that what we see in Libya is very close enough to counter-revolution because you have a movement that's countering the revolution, and we're able to dismantle the party, but there were networks in the institutions, the intelligence, the international parties who were exhausting this party, and this network have been able to accommodate or to take over this party. You wouldn't find that it was this party constituted a problem to any international parties because it assimilated completely. You would say they are doing politics, But at the end of the day, there is a contradiction and a gap between the leadership and the individuals or the members. How can you move within the same leadership and in the same society and move rightly in the political course without dropping part of your capacities, of your resources, of your ability to mobilize society? So what is lacking exactly with the Justice and Building Party is to have a vision that is based on a genuine understanding of the history and positioning of Libya, unless we are dwarfing the role of this party, say that this is what it could do given the conditions. In the interim, they would prepare for later. Now the final comment for Dr. Majida.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the speakers for their comments and their presentations. And I would like to thank Mr. Muhammad and Mr. Dr. Khairi for their comments. I will be very brief. The Libyan cannot be separated from the international context, and we know that there is a campaign against political Islam, which started in 2013 in what happened in Egypt. And as mentioned, the golden time after the revolution was from the victory of the revolution until 2013. And after that, there was the movement of no for extension. And that movement was immediately after the political exclusion. And the Libyan context as well, or the Libyan situation. Libyans became part of the crisis in Libya, and the other part of Libyans is divided in the regional and international positions. So getting things into the hands of Libyans now is still difficult, but we can push for what serves the interests, the best interest of Libyans. And I believe the party in this regard should have a strong position for the coming period. First, how to deal with this crisis and to think about developing strategic plans for the elections and the post-elections period in order to have a role rather than it used to think in the past how to survive in the landscape. Because it is, if they do so, they will be as if they are burning the fuel that they need in the coming period without having any influence in the coming period. So this requires a serious revision for correcting the internal structure and to have influence in the future. We hope that things in the future in the coming period will be better and the situation will be better for them. Thank you very much for this invitation again. Thank you very much all. You have presented very important ideas in the studying this experience. I would like to thank Mr. Sulaiman Abdel Qadir, Mr. Nizar Krikish, and Dr. Mr. Dr. Majid Al-Fallah, and Mr. Abu Bakr Bilal, as well as the commentator, Mr. Muhammad Umaish and Khairi Omar. Tomorrow we will study the Algerian experience, and tomorrow we're going to start at 2:30 Istanbul time, which means 11:30 Greenwich time. I hope to see you all